Hey, what's up everybody? This is Erin from Erin's Audio Corner, and today I'm going to be reviewing the new Klipsch RP-5000, 6000, and 8000F 2, newest version, floor standing speakers. Before we begin, I want to give a quick shout out to the folks at Audio Advice. They were the ones who actually sent these speakers to me on loan for review. I was not paid, and in return, all I'm asked to do is simply provide an affiliate link to go to their website if you decide that you want to buy these speakers after watching this review. We're going to start off with some general listening notes from my subjective evaluation. Now, I listened to all of these speakers before I ever measured them, and I listen in mono and I listen to stereo. And the reason I listen to mono is because it's easier to tell the timbral differences in a speaker. And for instance, if the highs stand out more than the mids, it's easier to spot when you're listening in mono. But I also like to listen to stereo because that's how I listen to a stereo. And I like the whole benefit of the things that I feel like I just don't get when listening in mono for the evaluations that go and correlate with my measurements. Once I perform my listening evaluations, I set up the measurements using Klipsch's near-field scanner. It is a state-of-the-art robotic device that allows you to get full anechoic data from 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz in a non-anechoic environment, such as my garage, like you see here in this video. And this is a great way to quantify the overall performance of the speaker itself before you put it into a room. That way you're able to determine how the speaker is most likely to perform in your room, some of the areas that you may want to avoid, some of the areas that you may like about the speaker. It basically helps you fine-tune your selection before you have to go through the process of ordering speakers and trying things out. It helps you whittle down the ones that are not going to be very good. Once I'm done measuring the speaker, I then bring it back to my room and I listen again with notes in hand to see if I can identify some of the things that I heard the first time with the data and see if I still notice them and see maybe if I'm off in the frequency range that I thought they were in. Having said all of that, generally speaking, these Klipsch floor standing speakers all sound very, 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 very similar. I did notice right away with all the speakers that the bass sounded rather thin. And I thought, is there just a room mode here or something that I've just not noticed before? Is it the positioning of the speakers? So I played around moving them, a little bit further out from the wall, a little bit closer to the wall. And no matter what I did, I just felt like the bass was, I hate to say it, but it was kind of underwhelming. When I looked at the data, I realized why. There seems to be a little bit of a baffle step mismatch in overall linearity between the speaker on the low end and the medium mid-range end. And we'll see that in the data. I'll talk about that a little bit more later. Now, aside from that baffle step, there also is a lack of low frequency extension. And with the dual 8-inch version, the 8000F, I actually expected that to dig down lower in frequency. But in my room, I found that it was barely getting to about 50 hertz. And for the most part, it seemed like it was doing about 60 hertz. But then after that, it was just kind of falling off in the room. Looking at the data, I also think I understand why that's the case. Now, I also wonder if the sensitivity is being traded off here, because I imagine that most people buying these speakers are probably going to be using them with subwoofers. And in that case, maybe Klipsch chose the design route of compromising low frequency extension in order to get higher sensitivity and lower distortion. All of these speakers do tend to have a bit of a high frequency tilt, and it varies from model to model, but in general, it's about 1.5 to 2 dB higher than the mean sensitivity of the speaker, meaning that around 2 kilohertz or so, the high frequency starts to drift up. And for me, that was a little bit too much. Combine that with the baffle step around the 200 to 300 hertz region, where the bass and mid-range transition kind of aren't quite equal. That mismatch in high frequency to that baffle step region seems to cause what I would consider a more noticeable discrepancy between the bass and the highs, as opposed to if the highs had just been boosted up, or maybe if the baffle step transition wasn't perfect, but that was the only thing. Then I probably would have been okay. But both of those paired together kind of creates a little bit of a storm there, where the overall timbral balance of the speaker just wasn't to my liking. I do suggest what you can do to alleviate some of that is to fire the speakers out into the room, meaning that Most of the time, I listen to speakers on axis because that's how they're designed to be listened to. The Klipsch speakers all tend to have a boost in the high frequency, and I can't help but wonder if that isn't expected because they intend for you to listen to them off axis. However, if you look in the manual, it actually does say to tow them on axis. So I find that a little bit odd. I do recommend that if you try these speakers out, you try them both ways, and I'm thinking you're probably going to like them towed out where they're facing more out into the room, maybe by about 20 to 30 degrees. The soundstage on all of these models is more on the narrow side of things, and that's not too unexpected given that it is a controlled directivity horn/wave-guided design. And typically what you find there is the directivity causes the radiation in the horizontal region to be about plus or minus 40 degrees to about plus or minus 60 degrees. And these speakers really are no exception to that. Now, the flip side of that is because they're a little bit more narrow in radiation, you do tend to find that you'll have more precise image placement within the soundstage. You don't get the wide soundstage that you might like and that I generally like, but you do seem to trade that off with more precise imaging. I've chosen some specific points in the data to go through for each of these speakers, and we're going to kind of go through these somewhat quickly and highlight some of the things that I saw in the data that correlated with what I heard. The first speaker is going to be the RP-5000F2, which retails for about $1,200 per pair. The CEA data shows us a somewhat linear response, but notice again, I'm talking about this baffle step region. So there's about 2 dB or so swing between the upper mid bass to the mid-range area. And then once you get above that region, it starts to kind of flatten out. You do see a little bit of a treble rise through here, but that's only about a dB or so for this particular model. And then going down here in the early reflections directivity index, it kind of follows along the same line except for right through here. And I believe that mismatch is due to the vertical offset between the tweeter and the woofers below it. I've noted a few things. Good sensitivity at about 90 dB. The baffle step again around 200 to 300 hertz. F3 is at about 55 hertz, and then F10 is at about 41 hertz. So you will need a subwoofer for this speaker. This is the estimated in-room response, and I've drawn a trend line through it to kind of give you an idea of what you can expect to hear in the room. There's a couple things I want to note here. Number one is the mid-range bump between about 300 hertz to about 1 kilohertz. And that's going to cause the sound to be a little bit, quote, boxy. This dip right through here at about 1.5 kilohertz or so is going to cause the sound to lack some detail. But otherwise, I actually found this speaker to be okay. This is the horizontal radiation pattern. And as you can see, through the mid-range, it's about plus or minus 50 to 60 degrees, depending on what frequency you're talking about. And then above about 3.5 kilohertz or so, you start to narrow up in intensity. Now, I would consider this somewhat narrow. Some people may like this depending on their room setup. If you have a very lively room, a very reflective room, you may find that you prefer a speaker that has a more limited radiation in the horizontal polar pattern. However, I prefer a wider radiation pattern. This is the vertical radiation. And the thing I want to note here is that you need to be between about plus or minus 10 degrees of the tweeter line, because if you're not, the sound is going to be varied quite a bit compared to what it would be directly on axis. Now, this is important for those of you who have multi-row home theaters and you want the people behind you to hear roughly the same thing that you hear on the front row. If they're above about 10 degrees or so, then they're not really going to hear quite the same thing. So keep this information in mind. In terms of response linearity, aka compression, it's pretty good at most volumes, but for the highest output around 102 dB at 1 meter, which is about 92 dB at 4 meters away for a pair of speakers in a room, you are still going to want a subwoofer. And I think that kind of goes without saying, but it's something that is worth pointing out. The next speaker is the RP-5000F2, which retails for about $1,500 per pair US dollars. Here is the CEA 2034 data. And again, we see this baffle step dip right through here. And this time it's actually a little bit more noticeable, and it's closer to about 3 to 4 dB swing, depending on what frequency you're looking at. The early reflections directivity, again, looks pretty good, except for this vertical mismatch right through here. But actually, I think this is okay, considering it's 2 6-inch woofers and a pretty large waveguide. A couple notes, 90 dB sensitivity, baffle step again. There's a mild high frequency tilt. depending on how you're looking at this. So if you draw an imaginary line right through 90 dB, you can see that at some frequencies, the high frequency area is anywhere from about 1.5 to 2 dB above that mean. The F3 is at 67 Hertz, and the F10 is at 33 Hertz, which means you're going to want a subwoofer. This is the estimated in-room response. The 5000F is actually more linear in response, whereas the 6000F shows some issues. Now, I've highlighted a few of those again, very similar to what I said with the 5000F, in that 300 to 1 kilohertz region sounds a bit boxy. The 1K region to 2K region sounds a little bit lacking in detail, but then we've got this new issue right through here, and that's going to cause you some sibilance or some edgy sound depending on what frequencies you're listening to or you're trying to pay attention to. In my listening sessions, these are the things I noticed. So they line up exactly with what my data is showing me. This is the horizontal radiation pattern. Again, similar to what we saw before, about plus or minus 50 to 60 degrees, somewhat narrow, could be helpful in smaller rooms or more reflective rooms. Vertical radiation pattern, very similar to the 5000F as well, plus or minus 10 degrees vertical listening window. And then compression, again, very similar to the 5000F. Fair good compression at typical volumes, and a subwoofer is going to be helpful. Last up is the big boy, the RP-5000F2, which retails for about $1,800 per pair. Here is the CEA 2034 data. On-axis response, listening window response, both show a mild dip through the 200 to 300 hertz region. Again, very similar to what we saw with the other two models. High frequency bump, again, same thing as we saw with the 6000F. And the early reflections directivity index, very, very similar to the other two models. Again, with this bump around 1 to 2 kilohertz due to the offset and vertical alignment for the mids, woofers, mid-range, and the horn. However, the one thing to note about this particular speaker is that it does have about 2 dB higher sensitivity, which, hey, free lunch. F3, F10, roughly the same as it was for the 6000F, which explains why in my listening sessions, I didn't feel like the bass was quite good enough. So I expected the bass should have gone lower because it was dual 8s and it's a ported enclosure. I was just thinking that this should extend down to 50 hertz, no problem. And it really didn't do that in the room, and that's why you're going to need a subwoofer. The other thing that I noticed was that the mid bass was kind of lean, and I think we see that evidenced in this right through here. And this is a very common theme where the mid bass region is about 2 dB lower than the mid-range region and the high frequency region. And that caused the bass to sound a little bit lean. Estimated in-room response looks very much like the 6000F. Similar notes as well. Bit boxy through here, a bit lacking in detail in the 1K to 2K region, but you don't have so much sibilance with this particular speaker. This time the bump is bumped up to about 2 to 5 or 6 kilohertz, and this time it sounds just more edgy. So certain guitar sounds tend to sound just like they pop out at you, and not really in a good way. That's something that I noticed from time to time with other speakers, but in this particular case, it stood out more to me. Just the overall timbral balance of the speaker and the ones before it, they all share the similar or same attributes that luckily EQ can help remedy, except for this 1 to 2 kilohertz region. That's going to be a little bit harder to remedy with equalization because that's due to the offset vertically between the horn and the midwoofer below it. But these other two areas you can equalize down and make this a more linear sounding speaker and still have good SPL overall. Horizontal polar pattern, this time is a little bit more narrow at about plus or minus 40 degrees to about plus or minus 50 degrees. Vertical pattern is about plus or minus 5 to plus or minus 10, and really it's about plus 5 minus 10 if anything. So this one's going to be a little bit more critical of your placement for your rear row listeners. But in terms of compression, response linearity, this is the best one of them all, and I'm not really surprised. It does a very good job in terms of providing you good dynamics. And that's it for this review. I hope you appreciate it. Hope you learned something. Again, I want to thank Audio Advice for loaning these out to me for review so everybody here can get a chance to see what they're about and figure out if these speakers make sense for you, or if you're just inclined to buy Klipsch products, which specific model is going to work best for your situation. If you haven't already, please hit the thumb button below, smash that sucker, because that helps me spread the word about what I'm doing. Also, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing. That would be great. With that all said, I will talk to you all later. Take care. Peace.